Our next guest is Thokozile Madonko. She is a researcher at the Public Economy Project, Southern Center for Inequality Studies at Wits University. And we're going to be talking to her about Budget 3.0 and the looming battle between politicians and technocrats in Treasury. Very good morning to you. Welcome to the program.
Good morning, and good morning to your viewers and listeners.
Thank you for your time. How does the ordinary person in the street understand exactly what is going on? Because we understand that the finance ministry working on what is inevitably called Budget 3.0, and why on earth did they entitle it as that? We're now likely to see an unprecedented process, which is going to involve politicians from different parties, also technocrats from National Treasury. How is this all going to play out? What is the time period that they're going to be allocated to sort out these differences? And what exactly are we talking about here? Welcome once again, and over to you.
Sure. So, the most important thing for your listeners and viewers to understand is currently we do not have a budget for 2025 2026. So,
Because
usually,
of the intervention by the DA, they wouldn't
yes.
accept the VAT increase, etc. So is that action being impacted on the entire budget?
On the entire budget. So they've had to go back to the drawing board. So, according to the Money Bills Amendment and Related Matters Act, which is a kind of a mouthful, but that act kind of governs the process of the budget process once it starts in Parliament. And so what happened was the parliamentary part of the passing of the budget didn't take place. So the fiscal framework, which is the kind of overall, it's a fancy word for the overall budget details that sets out the revenue, the borrowing, and the expenditure, sort of the large macro picture. That has to get passed before any of the other money bills, which is the division of revenue, which then says how much money goes to the different spheres of government, national, provincial, and local. And then we have the appropriations, which deals with the specific allocations to national departments. So those money bills get tabled all at the same time, and including any revenue amendments. So the VAT was an amendment, and so that was then an amendment bill, money bill, that was also tabled at the same time. And then there's some other bills that get tabled if there's a change to ESCOM or, whatever it might be, the financing, they then table. So essentially, people get a little bit confused because we have what is called a medium-term expenditure framework system in South Africa. So we often talk about 3-year budgeting. And so when we see the budgets getting tabled, we get to see the 2 outer years. The current financial year that we're trying to look at, which is the budget for the year, and then the 2 outer years. The only thing that is getting passed is the current budget. That is the most important thing. And so there's been a little bit of confusion around the VAT, for example, because the figures that were being thrown around were actually for the 3-year framework, not just for the current financial year of what they needed to find. So in some ways, this is a crisis made by National Treasury in the way that they have articulated the budget making process. And it's growing pains. I have some sympathy for them because they have been used to having the budget process being very smooth. There being very little attention even paid to the budget, really, and then rubber stamped through Parliament, passing the framework, then passing the money bills, and then it goes on to the provincial processes and then the local government processes. So what people need to understand is that it's a bit of a problem to call it 3.0 because the macroeconomic situation and the political situation globally as well as locally has changed quite a bit. And the International Monetary Fund and the Bureau of BER, they've all said, look, growth is actually going to be worse than the initial plans that Treasury was penciling in at the beginning of Budget 1.0. And so essentially for this new budget, it has to be a new budget. We have to have a completely different fiscal framework than the one that was not tabled in February, and then the one that was tabled in March. So the reality is that the budget making process, and for me, as somebody who has been studying the budget and the budget process for many years, is very excited about what it means to look at fiscal policy, so budget policy, in the context of coalition governments. And essentially, we're almost building the car as we drive. We don't have a clear idea of what it means to do budget making in a coalition context. And so we have to develop and design a system that works for South Africa. And at the moment, it's quite contested, as we're seeing, between the DA weaponizing it in some ways for other purposes, if the reports are to be believed. Parties agreeing to a fiscal framework, but not understanding that depended on a particular revenue assumption. And if you were revising that revenue assumption, which was the VAT increase, then that fiscal framework then couldn't really stay the same. So it would have to have changed. So there was a lot of kind of growing pains and learning how to make sense of this. The most important thing, though, I think for South Africans that they are interested in is, what does this mean for them on a day-to-day basis? What does this mean for them in order to be able to access public services? Because we are interested in how the budget affects public services and influences private services and private provision of services and so forth. So it has a role to play in both aspects. And so we see that the budget 3.0, which I still think should not be called 3.0, it should be budget brand new, is going to be tabled. Sorry, not should be, is going to be tabled, if all goes well, next week, Wednesday, on the 21st. Then the process starts again. They have to pass the fiscal framework in the House. So the committees will have public hearings on it. And then we're looking at about June, beginning of July, that we will have, hopefully, a budget for 2025, 2026. And my hope, sorry.
Carry on, your hope.
My hope is that the politicians and the technocrats will focus on the financial year currently. We need a budget now. We cannot afford, and South Africans cannot afford, to have a budget running as if it was last year. Things change, things are more expensive, prices change. We need to be paying nurses, we need to be paying doctors. So we want to be able to ensure that our programs and projects at a government level function smoothly. And it hampers that if they're having to go off last year's budget, as the PFMA allows.
Okay, I'm going to throw a whole host of questions and comments at you, and then you can respond, because we are running out of time. So you've said a lot there, and we hope and pray it doesn't go over the heads of ordinary people like myself, lay people like myself. But what I'm understanding is, obviously, the DA and other interested parties are busy politicizing this whole issue around the budget. It also means that and they've called for Inequality to step down, because according to them, because things hasn't gone their way, maybe because they've misunderstood, but they are politicizing it, and they're wanting him to step down as a head of Treasury. I don't know if that is a good idea or not. How does it impact? You also spoke about state employees, doctors, nurses, etc. Does that indicate that because of what has gone wrong currently and everything's on hold, that public servants are not being paid? And if they're not being paid, I should imagine public services could come to a halt. So the repercussion seems really pretty serious. And this whole issue being politicized is going to, and with local elections coming up, it's going to sway a lot the way people vote going forward. So a whole host of interconnectivity regarding this one issue, and that is the VAT situation, which has impacted the implementation of this current budget. Am I understanding it correctly?
So I just want to clarify, public servants will continue to be paid. Where there will be problems is if a department wanted to extend a set of programs in which they were going to get additional resources from this year's budget. They cannot do that. That's on hold. So if they wanted to hire more staff, they can't do that until the 2025-2026 budget is passed. So the current cohort of public servants should be being paid. There shouldn't be any problems because that comes under the last year's budget. The only problem is when you want to talk about new projects and new programs. So the interesting thing here is that essentially a budget is a highly political tool. It is something that can influence voters. We know this. And it has a role to play in the politics of a country. So it is interesting that, heads haven't rolled over the fact that this budget has not been passed. It might be that they haven't rolled because we're all learning. This is something new. We haven't ever had a coalition government of this kind, of this nature, testing all of the legislation. I mean, there was confusion within Parliament. There was confusion. Everyone was learning. What does it mean? The Act itself, the Money Amendment Bill Act, has never been tested. So it was being brought under scrutiny. So there was a lot of learning that was happening. And so maybe there's being given a bit of grace around the fact that this is a new terrain. But the reality is the adults need to come into the room and they need to pass a budget for 2025-2026. And they have to do it in a way that doesn't result in cuts to core services. This is what now South Africans need to make sure. They rallied around the VAT, but they need to rally around protecting core services. Because if there are huge expenditure cuts, which is what the minister has been alluding to, what Treasury has been saying needs to happen, because if they can't raise revenue, then there has to be expenditure cuts. The reality is that there are many organizations and groups, activist groups and research units that have provided evidence to Treasury and to Parliament that there are valid alternatives for raising revenue than that, and that they could raise the revenue that's needed to ensure that we have doctors, nurses, schools that are being appropriately maintained and looked after, roads that are being maintained and looked after, protecting our electricity grid and our ESCOM. So all of these things, and our ports and so forth. We need to ensure that we don't have unnecessary budget cuts that will then further almost shoot ourselves in the foot, because then in a context of low growth, you cut your government spending, that leads to further low growth and further problems. So we actually need to see an injection in the economy through government spending to say, we're optimistic that we can turn things around, and we're going to put money behind our optimism. So Operation Vulindlela becomes very important in saying we are going to extend the electricity grid. We're going to make sure our rail and ports are working appropriately. We're going to have broad-based infrastructure projects that enable us to produce and deliver water to communities. So we're also going to fix streetlights. We're going to fix the streets. We're going to make sure that our hospitals and clinics are functioning well. That's what a government budget should be. And it also protects women in particular. When you have good social spending on social infrastructure like health, education, social development, that's investing in our social capital, and it also invests in our care economy and takes away a lot of burden from women. Because when hospital services are cut, it doesn't mean that the caring goes away. It just means that it's no longer a public servant doing the caring, but now a grandmother or a young girl in a household who then takes on the burden of looking after a family member, when that should be a publicly funded, publicly provided care service. So we want to really look holistically at the budget, and we really need technocrats that understand the lived experience of South Africans.
We're running out of time. I'm going to just comment, and you can give me a short, sharp answer if you don't mind. Having said everything that you said makes perfectly good sense. But going forward then, people, technocrats and the powers at play regarding this current budget, if they continue, with this dragging this situation out, and we're talking about the impact on services and South Africa as a whole, you and I, and every man in the street. There has been calls for cutting down a very bloated government structure. Do you think that that's a fair call? And do you think that cutting down on the number of ministers and deputies that we have here in South Africa would make a difference? And those blue light brigades and the number of security guards for each minister or deputy minister, do you believe that that could be a starting point?
I think it is a starting point, but it's cosmetic. We are talking about millions of rands when we're talking about cutting down the millions. What we're looking for to inject into our economy is billions of rands. And so we need to look at spending reviews, absolutely. And we need to look at how government is spending, but big ticket items. So it could be about reforming particular ways in which government works, but looking for the billions, not the millions, the billions.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Thank you indeed for your insights. Thokozile Madonko, researcher at the Public Economy Project. Undoubtedly, we will be talking to her lots more in the future. It is 10:09, actually way over time that I should be out of here, but we still have another important matter to discuss this morning before I bid you goodbye.